Welcome to the Ellevate podcast, conversations with women changing the face of business. And now your hosts, Kristy, Wallace, and Maricella, Herrera.
Hello and welcome to the Ellevate podcast. This is your host, Maricella Herrera. Not your usual host, so as you can tell, this is not Kristy. Kristy is away right now, but she did do the interview with our guest today, Kay Fabella, and I am so excited for you all to listen to this. Kay is great. She is a consultant and drives DEI, so diversity, equity, inclusion in companies, as well as, helping companies work with a remote workforce, which is clearly top of mind currently as the world continues to change. Hope you all are having a great summer, getting ready for the fall and what comes next. And I hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello, Kay. Welcome to the Ellevate podcast.
I'm so thrilled to be here, Kristy. Thank you for having me.
We actually just taped your podcast a couple of, weeks ago now. Mm-hmm. And we really connected and, just have this shared, passion for creating change in this world, for creating a more equitable and equal world. And, part of what you and I have just recently been talking about is humans and humanness, and how we bring humanness into the workplace and into these connections and interactions we're having, and then how that then starts to shape our understanding of others and our connection with others. And I was wondering if you could share some of your thoughts on that, on what it means to be human, and particularly in a time like we're living in right now.
Yeah, definitely. It's such a profound question, right? Because we've, where we're sitting, many of us have been starved of human contact and interaction, or continue to be, depending on where you're listening to this in the world. And we've really truly come to realize what it means to be human, and all of our ups and all of our downs and all of the extremes over the past year and a half. And yeah, it's been really interesting, right? Because I think there's, someone who works in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I'm sure many of your listeners as well who are passionate about it, you realize that a lot of the reason why we have these conversations around DEI is because we still have a lot of work to do to create environments where all of this can show up and interact as our best selves, or as the selves that we're capable of bringing, or the full selves we're capable of bringing to the table in environments where they're not designed for us. And there's almost very much rooted in this idea of separate personal and professional that's still very pervasive in the workplace and continues to affect how we interact with one another. And then a pandemic happens and we're literally in each other's homes. And then the Black Lives Matter movement happens again and, touches all corners of the world, even here in Spain, where I've called home for the last 11 years. And you really realize how truly interconnected our world is, and how much we crave not just the ability to be across from one another and hold space for one another in the hard times, but also just to have somebody that you can trust to bring, whether it's your pain because you're going through some level of a mental health challenge, or you're struggling with a disability, or you're, closeted and living with your family and you aren't able to get out because of quarantine. And we're all in some level of upheaval and not feeling safe to bring that, or to at least share that, or feel safe to have the potential to share that with people around you that you spend most of your waking hours with, aside from your families. It feels like a real disjointed paradigm to navigate. And that idea of being human really is just, will you see me as I am? And I don't think we've still really processed what that means at the time of this recording, but how much more we crave that as individuals, especially those of us who come from historically excluded or marginalized backgrounds in the workplace. So I think this idea of humanness or humanity, we're really fully understanding the breadth of that, and how much more work we still have to do to create spaces where that we have the option to fully tap into what each of us defines that as at the table. And I think that's the question moving forward.
I love so much about what you just said, Kay, and especially that phrase, like, will you see me as I am? And it feels, to me as if that is not even the mantra, it's like the call of, so many marginalized communities within our society, within our workplaces. It's like, stop putting me in some, silo of identity and experience and trying to, not put the work into understanding like who I am, what I need to succeed, what even success may look like. And at Ellevate, we do a lot of work within our community around, how do managers be more inclusive and understand that, the teams you manage, should be diverse, and how you best support them in achieving success. What are some of the ways in which you approach this conversation around, seeing your employees as they are, and how you can best do better? Because I think most companies don't do a good job at that at all.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, coming back to the conversation from earlier, we know it's because the reason why equity has come to the forefront of the DEI conversation really is because we've realized that the history of the workplace as we know it was designed with a very small and very outdated version of an avatar, we'll say, in mind. And we're still playing catch up from that in a way to figure out how everybody who did not have access to those rooms and resources at the start has more catch up to do, right? Kind of approaching it from the intersectional lens, how many different starting lines there have been for different folks. And so my conversation really is always pointing back to, well, look at how the history of the workplace developed, being somebody who is, daughter of Filipino immigrants, born and raised in the U.S., now has lived in Spain and in the Europe region for all over a decade now. One of the conversations I have to remind people, it's like, yes, we're talking about, say, your headquarters in New York or kind of San Francisco, or very North America focused conversation, naturally, because that's where many of our companies are headquartered. But we also have to think about how a lot of those companies, if we look back even further in history, were developed again from this lens of who had access to rooms and resources first, and how that translated into power dynamics in the workplace that we're still seeing today. So from that understanding, or at the very least, it doesn't absolve people of what they're currently perpetuating in terms of behaviors and systems, but at least contextualize for people that this isn't something that, one, that any individual can solve on their own because we've inherited these things, and two, that it's a systemic change that needs to happen collectively for it to be sustainable. And thirdly, the most important element, especially as we've partnered with a lot of different companies, being that we're based in the EMEA region, who have come to us and said, hey, how do we translate DEI for our offices in Berlin or Madrid, where I'm based, or London, etc.? Because the conversations culturally are also very different in each of those places. Could you help us either not just translate it, but more importantly, contextualize it for our folks who are looking to engage and advocate for equity and inclusion for their particular context, but feel like their voices are maybe getting drowned out with so much of a focus from, say, the North American lens into the conversation. And so I think there's a lot of different layers there, but where we've seen a lot of interesting conversation, especially over the past year from our vantage point, is how do you unite the historical context to not absolve people of things, but really for them to understand this is inherited. So what do we do about it? And two, that it has to be systemic and behavioral. And that's the only way that we can, rather than focusing it entirely on the individual, it has to be something that is more pervasive for it to be sustainable and meaningful for the groups who've been most marginalized, who haven't historically had that access to those rooms and resources. And three, how do we adapt it to the places where, say, for example, the Black experience is very different in the United Kingdom, or for a place like Spain, where immigration was only really available after our General Franco, the dictator here, died in the 1950s. So we're looking at a lot of different layers there. And I think rather than it being overwhelming for companies, I think it's actually a really exciting opportunity for folks to lean into the conversation from their particular cultural lens and their particular vantage point to contribute collectively to a systemic and behavioral change within the organization. And that's kind of how we've been partnering with folks over the past year.
I really appreciate the work that you do, and I want to get into that more deeply in a moment. But a big part of what you're talking about, I mean, there's so many great nuggets here, but part of it is just that systemic change, and it does feel as if, as a society, as a global society as well, depending on where you are, things are it. We have a very short attention span, and it's like, okay, in the US, Black Lives Matter. All right, we're going to put in the work. We're going to, talk about this. We're going to create change. And then very quickly, the attention and resources then go in another direction because there's another, effort to focus on, or there's something else. And that's not going to achieve success, right? I mean, we need to be able to say, okay, here are the long-term initiatives and the ongoing work we're going to do around, supporting our Black communities. Here's the long-term, initiatives and the work we're going to do around supporting women or LGBTQAI plus or Indigenous, and go on and go on and go on. But if we're being responsive versus proactive and building in the structures and systems that will continuously support us making progress, then we won't make progress. And, certainly I know in many of the communities, that I've been a part of, the lack of focus on, say, Black Lives Matter right now is disheartening because we need to constantly be talking about this and doing the work. So are there systems that you've seen or structures or work that has been successful in keeping this top of mind and ongoing?
Yeah, and that's a really great point, right? It just feels like even amongst some DEI practitioners and myself, we've been calling it a game of trauma hot potato over the past year and a half, kind of begrudgingly, because it always felt like somebody's community was going to be grieving. So of course, we're worried about the conversation not being, how do I want to put this? That attention having an expiration date, right? And so I think it's really important when we're having the conversation that we move it away from the onus is on the individual to keep educating themselves and more around the how do we as a collective first recognize that each of our individual actions, even the ones that feel small, are going to have a ripple effect on the team and the organization as a whole if we continue to commit to that path. And two, that ultimately it's not about just us as individuals educating ourselves, but also holding even our managers and our employers accountable to continuing to do the work. And so I think it's this, how do we move from, oh, it's all on me now, learning and undoing things. And that's something you must continue to do. But how do you put it into practice now? And how do you do it in a way that first you do it within your respective community, especially the people who are of similar lived experience or background to you? How do you then, without causing additional harm, find ways that you can, confirm with a person who comes from a marginalized community, what is it that I can do best to serve you as, your team member? Because that makes more of a difference than finding an abstract insert person of marginalized background here to be your friend for the sake of you trying to, educate yourself on it. Who is somebody of an identity within your realm of influence that you can actually advocate for, and ask them how you can show up for them without treating them as the monolith of, one particular group only needing one set of things. And lastly, how can you lean on people collectively and really press for change collectively within your organization for, asking them, well, you made these statements a year and a half ago. How far have we come? And if we haven't come that far, more importantly, rather than me just holding you accountable, what is it that I or people like me or people on my team can do to make sure that this doesn't perpetuate the next time we release these numbers in the following year? So I think rather than it being such a one way, like us versus them. And it's very easy, I think, in a lot of this conversation, because there are so many groups and populations that would benefit from this, whose voices are almost elbowing their way to the front to be heard in a game of oppression Olympics. I think it needs to be a lot more, less individual focused and more, what can we all collectively gain and what can we all benefit from by all of us leaning into the change together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I do hear from many of the conversations I have, the uncertainty around how to approach this with your manager or your organization, and feeling like you can't ask those questions like, okay, you set these goals, how are we doing against those goals? Or maybe you haven't set goals. Should we be setting goals? Let's set goals. What is the process? What is the plan? And there's one thing on a sort of macro level there, with like, what is an organization coming forth with and what are they committing to? And then it drills down to that micro level about what are the dynamics in your team and how is your manager showing up and what is the work that they're doing? Because I think at every level of an organization or of a society or of a team, there's work to be done. So is there advice you have for an individual who wants to have these conversations, who wants to hold their company accountable or themselves? And like, how do you best approach that in a place where maybe you feel uncomfortable broaching that topic?
Yeah, I think, again, as you and I both know, within DEI, everything's context, right? So I think the first piece is, whenever I'm working, especially with somebody from a historically excluded or marginalized background who has actually experienced harm, I think it's really about finding your tribe of people or your inner circle that you can lean on within the company, because if you're going through something, then somebody else is probably going through it as well. So it's just finding out who those folks are. And strangely, the benefit of all of us being, or most of us still continuing to work from home, is that with so many different channels available to us, it's easier to network with people across departments than ever, even in different parts of the world. And then if you're looking for a way to hold someone accountable, I mean, again, this is one of those things where you have to respect, what your own sense of safety is before you then decide, this is something that I'm willing to bring up. And it's much easier to do that when you feel supported by folks around you. And when I'm having these conversations with managers who are almost on the other side of just as scared to have the conversations, like, what happens if somebody brings this forward to me? And all you can do is really lean into your humanity. Again, coming back to the top of our conversation, it's not your ego, it's the mission of your team. And it's the safety and well-being of a person who's coming forward and giving you the privilege of their story and saying, this is something that's happened to me. This is something that I've experienced. And I don't know what else to do except to tell you that this is something I'm trusting you with. That's a gift. And so rather than seeing that as something that, if you're the manager, for example, that has perpetuated that harm or has executed that microaggression or really allowed it to be permitted on the team because someone said something and you didn't notice it or you didn't realize that it was happening. If somebody is bravely stepping forward and coming to you, and the calculated risk, especially if they're coming from a marginalized community that they're taking, honor that and come up with a plan with that person to model different behavior moving forward. And I think approaching that from a level of humility, and also really being okay with the fact that ultimately what we're aiming for is the collective benefit of not just our team's productivity, but our people's capacity to fully show up as who they are. And that's going to require them putting themselves out there sometimes from places of, hey, this was not okay in my book, or this is, in my culture, for example, if you're looking from somebody from a different country, in my culture, this is not something that I've ever been taught to be comfortable with, like maybe being more open or being more vocal. Could you please support me on how to show up more fully and contribute more to the team? Because this is just not something that I've been taught to do from in my native country or my native language, for example. And everybody has such different contexts. So I think the best thing that a middle manager can do, or somebody in a leadership position can do, is approach it from the humility of, this doesn't make me wrong. Or rather, it's not that it's not right that someone's bringing this to my attention. And, even if it somehow messes with your understanding of the world at that point in time, it's just different. And if it's different, it's true for them. So how can I understand their truth to be able to fully allow them to be seen? Because ultimately it will benefit everyone around them if they feel that way and if everyone feels that way. And approaching it with that humility.
Thank you, Kay, for all of that. I would love to learn a little bit more about you. Could you share a bit about your story and how you got to this place?
Yeah, so it's a fun one. So as I said before, I'm a daughter of Filipino immigrants. I was raised in California, and I found my way to Spain as an undergrad in college studying abroad. And I first fell in love with Spain during that semester abroad, and I loved it. I found my way back here a few years later, and I fell in love with a Spaniard. That's why I'm here 11 years later. But you could safely say that whether it was growing up in a suburb of Los Angeles or going to college in DC or living in New England or living here, a question that has always followed me is one that I think many people may be familiar with, which is the famous second question of, one, where are you from? And the second being, where are you really from? And you learn early on that it's because people are trying to place you and understand who you are because they haven't seen folks who look like you. And at least initially for me, that became a very sore point when you're a young person trying to figure out belonging. But eventually, as you grow older and you start to see the world through different lenses and you start to develop a practice of cultural humility, you realize that it's actually a really unique opportunity to bridge gaps in understanding, to invite people into different worldviews and perspectives simply by saying, hey, this is actually who I am, this is what I've lived through, and this is where I'm from. And it expands people's view of the world if you approach it that way. And so I've always led with that since making that realization that I could go from leading with a story with clenched fists to open hands and actually extending that opportunity for connection with people. And I think naturally when you're a person who spends a good deal of your life translating, whether it's between immigrant parents and, their adopted country, or, being a bicultural person and then a tricultural person when you land in another country where you don't speak the language, you realize how important communication is and how important cultural understanding is in the context of how we interact. And I think I just naturally was fascinated by, why is it that someone's view of the world is different versus someone else? And found my way into communications work. And because I was doing workshops around how to craft your story, how to tell it, how to, use your voice for good, I eventually was tapped by a women's ERG here at a financial services company to come and deliver a workshop on self-advocacy. And I realized after that workshop that the workshop was just a one-off, but what was going to happen next? What was happening in the culture of the organization that was perpetuating women not being able to feel safe to share their story or feel safe to voice their opinion or contribute to teams in a way that would actually benefit them and their careers and those around them. And that became, without me realizing it, my rabbit hole for DEI work, because I think I was always curious as to, okay, I'm giving you the intervention, but what's going to happen after? What's the culture around your environment that is actually influencing you and your ability to show up as your full self, the way that I realized that I was naturally doing my whole life, of like, I can only show up as my full self if I'm translating me in a way on behalf of myself to different people in different contexts. And so that eventually led to, starting to do work with other financial services companies, other employee resource groups, other then eventually tech companies. And originally, before the pandemic, I was specifically working with companies on remote work strategies for their people who were working in different parts of the world. How do you make sure they're included on teams? And we all know how that went with 2020. And it was really because of the same thing of what we're navigating at the moment with the hybrid work conversation is how do we make sure that people stay connected to the culture of the organization when their voices may not necessarily be heard, or they're not necessarily counted because they're not physically seen in the office. And that's just as important to the conversation as, you know, whether or not somebody's on the receiving end of microaggressions in a physical environment. So that's kind of how I got here. I eventually started my company, Inclusion in Progress, LLC. And now we've been partnering with companies around the globe like Instagram and the IMF and Philips and more to really, how do we partner with you to, one, help you with intercultural communications, to build inclusion into your virtual and your in-person workforce, and three, how do we make sure that the identities that we're measuring to really build equity and inclusion are focused on not just one cultural context, but also really culturally tailored to the different parts of the world where you're trying to make impact. And that's a bit about my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, it's amazing. I've had, as have you, the great honor of listening to a number of stories for our podcast, and it's always, and I share this for our listeners, just this idea of how each individual experience, things that happen within our lives, you know, they all, you don't realize it always in the moment, but when you look back, you see how all of these conversations, these touch points, these, you know, moving to Spain and, you know, and the questions you get and all of that start to build into a purpose, and the purpose you have that you're passionate about, and your connection to the work that you do. And so it's kind of just being cognizant of all of these, you know, individual moments, how they impact us, and, you know, inspire us to do something. I love that story. And, you know, thinking into the future now, Kay, and particularly in a time where, you know, in the US, for example, there had been, you know, I mean, the pandemic is just mind boggling in a way. I mean, beyond that, obviously, but, you know, I remember back March of 2020 and being like, okay, we're, you know, going to be back in the office in April. And then it's like,
If only we
okay,
knew.
no, not April. It'll be September 2020. And then you're like, okay, no, it'll be September 2021. And now many companies are saying, okay, we're going to push that out further. Right. And it's, you know, it's interesting to me because we initially, when we did this whole work from home experiment, which is now a way of life, and has been for a long time a way of life for many, when you kind of fall into something, you're being reactive. You're not being proactive about how do we set up the best structures and systems, communication, inclusion in this environment to ensure that all people succeed. And just as you were talking earlier, Kay, about how, you know, we, based on maybe our identity or our lived experiences, the languages we speak, we communicate differently. I mean, working from home is also a very different way of communicating. Some people are much better at communicating up and out about their experiences. Some aren't. Some are, you know, do much better in sort of the environment of an office and the, you know, many communication touch points that are physical and, you know, seeing someone and being across the table from them. And so it's, you know, we're in this entirely new environment where, you know, how you succeed is a completely different game, and how you feel included, how you feel heard. And you've been doing this work for many years before 2020. So what is some of the advice you give to teams and to managers and to individuals to, you know, best show up or best succeed and best support others in a remote environment?
Yeah, it's funny. It was one of the few times when the pandemic hit that in my, you know, I get by with tech, but not really. And I could, for once, teach people how to use Zoom because I've been using it for so long. But no, aside from that, I really was, I was partnering with a lot of folks, again, like you said, with the structural piece of, okay, so understanding one, especially given that this is, as you rightly put, a work from home experiment, not we're returning back to the office and going back to work. It's because we've been at work the whole time. It's been a very strange situation for many people. So I think it's first, I work with people around understanding that different states could be at play when you're coming to a meeting, right? And so maybe not everybody is comfortable with sharing what it is that they're going through outside. I think you and I share this, like, we're pretty radically transparent about things, and we kind of tend to lean towards over communication over not, but that we know that not everybody is that way. And especially if you've never met your team member before, you're going to have to build that trust with that person specifically. So when I talk with managers about implementing better meetings, for example, or better remote practices, one of the first things I ask them to do is give space before getting into the meat and potatoes, as it were, of meeting. How is everyone today on a scale of, whether it's a 1 to 10, or, pop a, there's so many tools now that you can use where it's literally just, anonymized colors in the chat, where you can kind of visually see what the mood is of your people before you dive right in, because we've just been so accustomed to just work through, just power through. But everybody is getting to this place where even the most mentally sound and strong people, our stamina is being tested. So what can you do to at least acknowledge states of people? If, say, for example, you go from the 1 to 10 and everybody's somewhere around a 4, well, that informs you as a manager of how do you lead with that? Or how do you, say, for example, if nobody volunteers or wants to talk about it because they don't feel comfortable to do so, how do you model that and say, well, I see there are a lot of 4s here. How do we, how do you as a manager say, I'm going through, quite a bit of uncertainty myself. Obviously we don't know what the finish line is for this pandemic with all the different variants, and it is quite scary. Here's what I've been feeling. And, does anybody want to add to that, rather than jumping right into the meeting? If you're at a 7, kudos. I don't know that many people that are these days. Well, depending on the state of the day and how much you make time for your own self-care and joy. But you then as a manager also know how to lead in that conversation as well. But the fact that you've even acknowledged that there are different feelings and states in the room, even if nobody contributes, just models for people, like, I see you as humans. And if for whatever reason, everybody's, say, for example, going back to the number conversation, because I've used it for quite a bit of training over the past year, if everybody's not feeling at their top, well, maybe it's on you as a manager to say, well, who's taken PTO, or who wants to reschedule this meeting for a later date? Because you can model that, right? It's not just about, I think there's a lot of, flexibility that people need to lean into, knowing that at any given point, any part of our world can go sideways, especially given what we're living through. Other things really are just, how do we move away from synchronous to asynchronous communication channels? I think everybody's kind of well versed in that now, but really working with people to respect, again, that your state of, being mommy while working from home and also trying to play teacher is going to be a very different time frame of when you're going to be available and responsive versus somebody who maybe has a partner who can, help them cook or whatever it happens to be. And so rather than it being such a, I'm expecting an answer now, it's training our brains to value transparency and the product done, and using the channels as a way to really synchronize and check in on, as long as we know that X particular deliverable or whatever it has to be before the end of the week is there. It doesn't matter the hour that somebody responds to me, and everybody has the capacity to decide and set the hours that they receive their notifications as well. And so modeling that as a way for managers and really any sort of a person who's trying to communicate in this remote environment, especially across time zones, the possibility of, engaging with engaging with the work in the state and then the capacity that they have with what's in front of them, and moving away from this idea of, productivity and being connected at all hours to actually disconnecting and modeling that as well. And last but not least, it's how do you create channels for non-work communication and actually creating those spaces where you are able to see others as humans, especially for all the folks that we've talked to through the pandemic who've never physically seen their team members. They're craving that human contact. They're craving that sense of, now we have an inside joke or a shared experience in the office together. What are you doing to create that possibility? And I know it feels like a little bit more work, but what is it that you can do collectively, even just rotating assignments for the team of like, here's the conversation we're going to lead around recipes or, skill sharing or dog photos, I don't know, or cat photos, trying to be inclusive here. There's so many different ways that you can stay connected, but it's just offering that container for people to feel like this is my team and they have my back and I can show up strangely, even if it's just an emoji or a photo that I share every so often, to know that these are real people that I'm working with and creating spaces for those interactions to happen as well. So those are kind of 3 areas that we've operated in over the pandemic and definitely beforehand.
Yeah, it's a good reminder about modeling behavior too, because I'm not good at personally, I'm not good at that. I kind of came up through the workplace during a time when technology and ability to communicate anytime, anywhere was rapidly shifting. I started working when I didn't have a cell phone, right? And I had this big clunky desktop computer and I could only access it from the office. And then things have changed so quickly. And I believe for specifically my generation, where FaceTime was such a thing because you could only work when you were in the office. And then, quickly now they had Palm Pilots and then, Blackberries and all of these things. I have created in myself habits where I'm always on and I'm always looking at email. I'm always responding to things. And the signals that sends to my team, even if I say, oh, you don't look at this now, don't respond to this now, the signals it sends is, you lead by example. So for all of our listeners here, just to be very aware of, how we not just say, be clear on expectations, but also really model that as well is important. But Kay, thank you so much for joining us today on the Ellevate podcast. This was such a great conversation and always good to connect and catch up with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Kristy.
Thanks so much for listening to Ellevate. If you like what you hear, help a girl out. Subscribe to the Ellevate podcast on iTunes. Give us 5 stars and share your review. Also, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at EllevateNTWK, that's Ellevate Network, and become a member. You can learn all about membership and all the great things that Ellevate Network is doing at our website, www.ellevatenetwork.com. That's ELLEVATE network.com. And special thanks to our producer, Catherine Heller. She rocks. And to our voiceover artist, Rachel Griesinger. Thanks so much, and join us next week.
92% of households that start the year with Peloton are still active a year later.
92% because of a bike?
Not just bikes. We also make treadmills and rowers.
Oh, let me guess, for elite athletes only, right?
Nope. It doesn't matter if you're an avid exerciser or new to working out. Peloton can help you achieve your fitness goals. 92% stick with it. So can you. Try Peloton bikes, tread, or row risk-free with a 30-day home trial. New members only. Not available in remote locations. See additional terms at onepeloton.com/home-trial.